When Rome Odunze admitted a foot fracture left him with a permanent new normal and altered bone structure, he accidentally exposed a massive red flag that sent the Bears into full PR panic. Within hours, a suspicious damage control campaign forced him to retract the quote and claim he was completely fine, desperately trying to bury the slip-up before it derailed fan confidence. In this deep dive, we break down the medical reality of running routes on altered foot mechanics, analyze press conference body language handlers tried to hide, and trace how this cover-up impacts Caleb Williams' offense. We'll examine historical wide receivers whose careers spiraled from similar minor foot issues and fact-check Odunze's actual training camp tape against the team's public narrative. Stick around to the end because the footage tells a completely different story than the front office is selling, and our final verdict will reveal whether Chicago is sitting on a ticking time bomb. The entire saga began with what should have been a standard baseline summer availability for Chicago's prized former first-round pick. Standing behind the microphone, relaxed in his post-practice gear, Odunze offered a candid answer when pressed on the lingering discomfort from his previously reported foot injury. Wide receivers, especially young ones trying to establish themselves, often lean on raw honesty when discussing physical setbacks because they view pain management as a badge of honor. But Odunze went a step beyond basic rhetoric when describing the healing process. He detailed how the stress fracture had reformed the structural landscape of his foot, explaining that the calcification and bone callus development had essentially created a brand new internal baseline, a new normal that required him to adapt his movement patterns. To anyone outside the medical realm, it might have sounded like a young athlete offering an insightful window into modern sports rehabilitation. But to athletic trainers, biomechanists, and high-stakes front offices, those specific words signaled a massive red alarm ringing across Hallas Hall. An altered bone callus structure in a high-velocity wide receiver's foot is not merely a bump in the road, it is a permanent structural shift in a high-stress, weight-bearing area. In the NFL, wide receivers generate tremendous explosive force on every single route, pushing hundreds of pounds of pressure through the foot during sudden breaks, hard cuts, and pressman releases. When bone structure shifts even slightly, it alters how force distributes through the arch, ankle, and lower chain. Odunze's casual disclosure painted a picture of a young star navigating a fundamentally modified foundation, raising immediate concerns about long-term structural integrity and compensational injuries. Yet, within a matter of hours, the tone of the entire narrative underwent a jarring, whiplash-inducing shift. Media members were suddenly summoned back or given follow-up statements where Odunze walked back his previous diagnosis with incredible urgency. Gone was any mention of calcification, mechanical adjustments, or structural changes. In its place was a rigid, rehearsed company line asserting that he felt entirely healthy, that his foot felt amazing, and that the previous comments were simply a misunderstanding or an overstatement of a routine recovery process. This rapid, mechanical retraction instantly set off alarm bells for Beats reporters and fans alike. In modern professional sports, when an athlete drops a surprisingly specific medical detail and immediately follows it with corporate-sounding backtracks, it rarely means the original statement was wrong. Instead, it signals that the franchise's public relations department stepped in to control the damage. In Chicago, where the fan base has endured decades of physical setbacks, lingering health issues, and opaque communication regarding key offensive pieces, the sudden shift felt all too familiar. The quick backtrack did not put out the fire. It threw gasoline directly onto the flames of suspicion. The motivation for the Bears organization to pull the emergency brake on this narrative is painfully obvious. High-profile young talents like Odunze are foundational blocks for a franchise attempting to build a sustainable contender around Caleb Williams. Any perception that Odunze is carrying a chronic, structurally destabilizing foot issue threatens far more than just week-to-week game plans. It impacts fan morale, betting lines, fantasy projections, and perhaps most importantly, the tactical leverage Chicago holds over opponents who structure their game plans around containing explosive outside weapons. If opposing defensive coordinators know a star receiver cannot sustain hard plant cuts due to altered foot mechanics, the entire chess match changes before kickoff even arrives. As a result, the situation has devolved into a classic standoff between public narrative and underlying athletic reality. Is Rome Odunze genuinely past the worst of his stress fracture, simply misspeaking when he attempted to explain basic bone healing? Or did he accidentally peek behind the curtain and reveal a chronic structural hurdle that could silently compromise his movement, cap his explosiveness, and haunt his career trajectory? The public relations engine wants everyone to move on and focus on practice highlights, but the timeline of events, the specific medical terms dropped, and the sheer desperation of the backtrack suggest that this story is far from over. To truly understand why a simple phrase like new normal sends shockwaves through the front office, one has to peel back the tape and examine the complex, fragile architecture of the human foot under elite athletic stress. A wide receiver in the NFL is essentially a high-performance vehicle transferring immense kinetic energy through a handful of small, specialized bones. When an athlete suffers a stress fracture, whether in the fifth metatarsal, the navicular, or another weight-bearing structure, the body undergoes a natural healing process that relies on microarchitectural remodeling. As the body attempts to repair tiny microcracks caused by repetitive mechanical fatigue, it lays down a disorganized weave of new bone tissue known as a bone callus. Over time, this callus ideally smooths out and reorganizes into dense, aligned bone, capable of handling maximum load. However, when a fracture is subjected to premature stress or heals under suboptimal conditions, that callus can form abnormally, creating a localized mass of hypertrophic bone that permanently alters the foot's structural contour and weight distribution. In day-to-day life, a slightly altered bone callus is virtually meaningless, but for an NFL receiver whose craft demands elite deceleration, violent directional changes, and explosive vector shifts, even a fraction of a millimeter in structural deviation fundamentally alters the physics of motion. When Rome Odunze mentioned that his foot had adapted to a structural new normal, he was describing a biomechanical shift that forces his body to compensate every single time his cleat digs into the turf. When a wide receiver executes a hard plant cut against pressman coverage, hundreds of foot-pounds of force collide with the ground in a fraction of a second. If the primary bone structure is modified by a thick callus, the force vector no longer disperses evenly across the metatarsals. Instead, that stress gets redirected into adjacent secondary structures, the surrounding soft tissue, the plantar fascia, or neighboring bones that were never designed to absorb that specific magnitude of kinetic load. This dynamic creates a compound medical risk that modern sports medicine professionals treat with extreme caution. Running routes on an altered bone foundation introduces a domino effect of kinetic chain breakdown. In the short term, the athlete might feel minimal pain while in straight-line sprinting, masking the underlying issue during routine drills. But the moment they are forced to sink their hips, plant hard on an outside edge, and explode back toward the ball, the altered pressure point generates micro-trauma. Over weeks of intense regular season reps, this compensatory loading frequently triggers secondary ailments, severe plantar fasciitis, peroneal tendonitis, or worse, recurrent stress fractures directly adjacent to the original repair site. An athlete trying to protect an uncomfortable or modified foot will unconsciously alter their stride mechanics, shifting pressure to their ankles, knees, and hamstrings, creating a cascading cycle of soft tissue breakdowns. The history of the NFL is littered with cautionary tales of elite wide receivers whose stardom was derailed not by catastrophic single-play tears, but by seemingly minor foot issues that were downplayed during summer camp. Consider the career trajectory of Sammy Watkins, who entered the league as a generational explosive threat. Early in his career, Watkins suffered a stress fracture in his foot that required a surgical screw. What was initially framed as a routine recovery quickly turned into a multi-year saga of secondary foot surgeries, nagging structural discomfort, and lost explosiveness. Watkins went from a dominant target to a player who struggled to stay on the field for a full slate of games, largely because his underlying foot mechanics were never truly the same. Similarly, former Dallas Cowboys star Bryant saw his elite reign cut short after dealing with recurring foot issues that began with a bone injury. Bryant's dominant playing style relied heavily on physical press release techniques, jump ball contested catches, and violent, sudden cuts. Once his foot structure was compromised, his ability to consistently burst out of breaks degraded. The repeated attempts to push through structural foot discomfort led to altered movement mechanics, recurring lower body soft tissue issues, and ultimately accelerated the back end of his prime far faster than anyone anticipated. These historical precedents explain why the Bears' public relations machine acted so swiftly when Odunze dropped that critical phrase. History shows that once a wide receiver begins adapting to a new normal in their foot, the odds of sustained injury-free elite production collapse dramatically. The team isn't just worried about missing a game or two in October, they are terrified of entering a multi-year cycle where their young blue-chip receiver is constantly battling recurring bone strain, secondary muscular tears, and lost top-end speed. When an NFL player's structural foundation changes, their entire athletic ceiling hangs in the balance. To grasp how deep this damage control campaign really runs, you have to follow the chronological sequence of events as they unfolded on the ground at Hallas Hall. The saga reached a boiling point when Rome Odunze met with reporters during off-season availability. Standing in front of the media backdrop, Odunze dropped a bomb that instantly set the NFL world ablaze. He admitted that recovering from his foot stress fracture meant getting used to a new normal, adding that the bone break laid down calluses that altered the structural makeup of his foot, comparing the permanent shift to tearing an AC joint. Veteran beat writers instantly flagged the quote as the most alarming comment of the day. Sports injury experts on social media began sounding the alarm on long-term stress patterns, and within minutes, the clip went viral across fantasy football networks and Chicago sports radio, throwing fan confidence into an absolute tailspin. What followed was a masterclass in modern corporate PR intervention. The moment the quote took on a life of its own, threatening the narrative around the team's top blue-chip receiver, the front office stepped in to regain control of the room. By the time training camp kicked off, Odunze was thrust right back in front of the microphone to publicly walk back his words. He claimed he simply didn't articulate it well, stating that he had set up a fastball for reporters and insistence that the quote was blown out of proportion. Gone was the medical breakdown of altered bone structures and calluses. Instead, Odunze repeatedly deployed heavy emphasis on buzzwords, declaring his foot felt great and amazing, and insisting he didn't even think about it anymore. Yet, dissecting the body language of that follow-up press conference reveals an athlete walking a tightrope between rehearsed PR lines and genuine frustration. During his initial unscripted disclosure, Odunze spoke with relaxed, matter-of-fact transparency, the posture of a player casually explaining his physical reality. But during the clarification session, the non-verbal cues told a completely different story. Odunze's posture was rigid, his gaze repeatedly shifting as he carefully selected corporate-approved phrases to neutralize his prior medical revelation. Film study from early training camp drills only adds to the intrigue. While he ran routine routes with his signature smoothness, close observation of his deceleration phases showed subtle adjustments in how he planted that foot to absorb force on sharp breaks. This rigid backpedal exposes the inner workings of the modern NFLPR playbook. Front offices understand that an unmanaged injury narrative does not just affect local headlines, it ripples through the entire multi-billion-dollar football ecosystem. Admitting a key receiver is dealing with a chronic, modified bone structure damages team leverage, inflates opponent game plans, sends betting odds fluctuating, and creates dark clouds over quarterback development. The Bears needed Odunze to reframe the story immediately, suppressing public panic before the season even began. But forcing a player to claim a structural new normal was just a bad choice of words, cannot erase the anatomical reality of what he originally confessed. The PR machine can scrub a soundbite, but it cannot change how bone calluses interact with high-speed cuts on turf. If Rome Odunze's foot injury is far more serious than the Bears are willing to publicly admit, the consequences for Chicago's offense are catastrophic. In Ben Johnson's high-powered offensive system, the perimeter X receiver is not just a statistical contributor. He is the structural engine that dictates how defense coordinators deploy their coverages. With veteran playmaker DJ Moore no longer on the roster to draw safety help over the top, Odunze was slated to step into the definitive number one target role. The entire design of Johnson's passing attack relies on a dominant outside threat who can consistently beat pressman coverage on the boundary, pull safety help away from the middle of the field, and force secondary units into impossible compromises. If Odunze loses even 5% of his explosive burst or struggles to sink his hips for sharp cutting break routes due to a compromised foot structure, the geometric integrity of the entire scheme collapses. Defenses will no longer respect the deep perimeter burn threat, allowing opposing cornerbacks to press tightly with single coverage, while safety help sits comfortably in the intermediate zones. The once spacious passing lanes that Johnson creates through motion and play action will suddenly compress, forcing the entire offense to operate in tight, claustrophobic windows. This structural vulnerability becomes even more volatile when looking at the rise of electric playmaker Luther Burden III. Drafted to bring game-breaking quickness and run-after-catch dynamic versatility to Chicago, Burden has rapidly ascended in practice reps, demonstrating elite separation speed and an aggressive, fearless play style that fits Johnson's play-calling preferences. In Johnson's offense, target share is earned through precision and trust. While Burden's initial profile was centered on working inside the numbers and operating in open space like a versatile weapon, his rapid development makes him an immediate threat to swallow up high-value targets if Odunze's physical movement limits his route tree. If Odunze cannot consistently win on isolated island routes on the outside, Johnson will naturally shift the focal point of the passing game toward players who can generate instant separation. While having multiple weapons is a luxury, shifting target dominance to a secondary piece changes the entire offensive identity. Burden thrives when defenses are forced to worry about a deep boundary threat. If Odunze cannot draw that primary coverage tilt, Burden faces doubled brackets and restricted running lanes, reducing his game-breaking efficiency. Perhaps the most critical cost of this foot situation falls directly on quarterback Caleb Williams and his ongoing development. Great quarterback play is built on subconscious trust, the unwavering belief that when a passer lets the ball go on a 3-step or 5-step drop, his receiver will arrive at a precise landmark at an exact millisecond. Williams and Odunze spent their entire rookie entry period building that crucial timing, connecting on explosive plays and clutch fourth down conversions that proved how dangerous their rapport could be when working on the same wavelength. However, that elite timing relies entirely on physical consistency. If a receiver's altered foot mechanics force him to take slightly longer to come out of his break, or if he hitches on a plant foot to guard against sharp pain, the quarterback's internal clock gets completely disrupted. When a quarterback loses faith in a receiver's break speed, he stops throwing with anticipation. Instead of releasing the ball before the receiver turns, beating the defensive coverage with pinpoint placement, the quarterback hesitates, waiting to see the receiver physically open before delivering the pass. In the NFL, that split-second hesitation is the difference between an explosive 20-yard gain and a drive-killing sack or interception. For Caleb Williams, who needs clear, reliable rhythm in Johnson's offense to take his game to the absolute elite tier, having his main perimeter option battling a hidden physical limitation is a nightmare scenario. If Odunze is compromised, Williams is forced to push balls into tighter windows, scramble out of clean pockets, and shoulder an unfair mechanical burden to compensate for missing explosive downfield targets. Ultimately, the ripple effects of a lingering foot fracture reach far beyond a single player's stats sheet. An injured receiver on the boundary turns a multidimensional modern NFL offense into a predictable short-area passing game. The Bears built this roster with the expectation that Odunze would step up as the load-bearing pillar of the wide receiver room. If his foot injury forces him into a reduced role or compromises his route running efficiency, Chicago's explosive ceiling drops precipitously. The front office can attempt to mask the severity of the issue through press releases and vague injury updates, but once the game tape rolls and real defensive coordinators test Odunze's plant foot with aggressive press coverage, the true cost of this injury will be exposed for the entire league to see. When you weigh the public statements against the concrete physical evidence, the true picture of Rome Odunze's foot health becomes a fascinating tug-of-war between team-sanctioned spin and undeniable biomechanical reality. On one side of the scale, the Chicago Bears point to his active practice participation throughout the start of training camp. He is out on the field at Hallas Hall, running full speed routes, catching passes in 7-on-7 drills, and taking first-team reps beside the rest of the starting unit. The coaching staff insists that if he hadn't spoken up back in June, no one observing his movement would have suspected he was operating on a compromised foundation. To the casual observer, full practice participation is the ultimate clean bill of health. Proof that the stress fracture which sidelined him at the end of last season is buried in the past. However, a closer look at his rehab methodology and practice workload reveals an undeniable layer of calculated load management. Odunze explicitly admitted that he opted against off-season surgery, choosing not to insert stabilizing hardware like screws or rods into his foot. That decision allowed the fracture to bridge via natural bone callus formation, but it also left the surrounding structural environment inherently altered. While he is currently clearing the bar for non-contact drills and practice reps, training camp is vastly different from the violent, unscripted intensity of a full 17-game NFL regular season. In practice, drills are controlled, surfaces are predictable, and reps are strictly monitored by sports science teams. But when real games begin, receivers are forced to make unscripted, max-effort plants on uneven turf under the physical collision of pressman cornerbacks. The fact that Odunze remains on a rigorous daily off-field maintenance and rehab schedule, constantly treating both feet to stabilize the structural shift, proves that his foot is far from a closed case. This brings us to the ultimate verdict for Chicago Bears fans heading into the 2026 season. Should you be genuinely worried, or is this entire drama just an overblown media storm? The answer lies somewhere in the dangerous middle ground, between immediate panic and total complacency. Odunze is not facing a career-ending crisis today, nor is he likely to sit out early season games if his current trajectory holds, but dismissing his initial new normal confession as a simple slip of the tongue is a dangerous mistake. When an elite wide receiver publicly acknowledges that his bone structure has shifted and created new pressure points, he is describing a permanent alteration to his athletic mechanics. History has shown time and again that non-surgically repaired stress fractures in the foot carry an elevated risk of recurrent strain, secondary stress reactions, or compensatory soft tissue injuries down the road. The real concern is not whether he can run a go route in July. It is whether that altered foot structure can withstand the cumulative force of hundreds of hard plants, cuts, and landings come November and December without degrading his explosive burst or triggering a major setback. Ultimately, the front office had every incentive to orchestrate a swift PR walkback, replacing frank medical candor with practiced corporate optimism. But game film and physical mechanics do not lie, and as the season unfolds, every plant step and break route Odunze puts on tape will be under an intense microscope. Chicago is betting heavily on Odunze to serve as a cornerstone of their offensive resurgence, but operating on a modified foundation means the margin for error is razor thin. Do you believe Rome's sudden backtrack that his foot is completely fine? Or do you think this is a classic NFL PR cover-up hiding a ticking time bomb? Drop your thoughts below, let's debate it in the comments, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more in-depth NFL medical breakdowns and film